Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the session on fiscal instruments for green growth. My name is Vikram Wej. I am with the Climate Business Department at the International Finance Corporation, the private sector affiliate of the World Bank, and I in particular focus on climate finance and policy. I have the pleasure and honor of moderating this session today, along with four very accomplished panelists who I will introduce in due course as we proceed. Before starting, I just wanted to actually just set the context. I was thinking about what to say here when overnight a couple of different reports came out, which I thought just mentioning those would be quite interesting in terms of the context of what the session is supposed to talk about, as well as for some of us who were in the main plenary over lunch had to hear the, I don't know how to call it, opto-pessimistic speech by Professor Randers. So I thought I just mentioned these studies to you. The US Department of Energy overnight sort of released a study showing that shale gas resources globally are going to be vast enough to cover a decade of oil consumption. And with this assessment, the natural gas reserves for the world have gone up by nearly 50%. That throws an interesting twist to those who believe natural gas is a transition fuel versus those who believe that we need to get out of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. The other study that came out was by IEA. One of the moderators yesterday invoked Fatih Birol, who he called probably the best energy economist of our times here, and who has in the past said that we are going through a period of unprecedented uncertainty. And they released a special report, the World Energy Outlook, which was called sort of redrawing the energy climate map. And the first thing, it starts off by reiterating that we are not on track to meet the 2-degree goal. We heard that at lunch. We are definitely not going to meet the 2-degree goal if we stay on that track. Not surprisingly, it also says that the energy sector is the key to limiting climate change. It notes that despite positive developments in many countries, we actually set a record last year in terms of the energy sector emissions. They grew by 1.5%, and around 31, 32 gigatons have sort of been the most ever. And if this sort of stays on track, we are actually going to exceed our emissions budget, if you will, in the energy sector by 4 gigatons in terms of what we are supposed to be, the track we're supposed to be on for achieving or staying within 2 degrees and the emissions we need to be at by 2020. So, but he actually the report ends, or rather sort of talks about a 4-for-2 proposal. It says that there are 4 policies that actually are very relevant for this panel that could be introduced in a way that buy us more time and potentially keep us on track to limit temperature increases to about 2 degrees. These, and if you forgive me for reading these out because they sort of, didn't want to get them wrong. It says targeted energy efficiency measures could reduce energy-related emissions by 1.5 gigatons per year. And this goes to, this talks about energy performance standards for buildings, for lighting, for new appliances, for HVAC, heating and ventilation, air conditioning systems, motors and transports. Usual suspects, as we all know, but the challenges in how to get to it in terms of standards and perhaps fiscal instruments. The other one they talk about is no new subcritical coal-fired power plants and sort of reduction of use of the less efficient ones. Third one is to eliminate methane releases from upstream oil and gas industry, or not eliminate, actually he says only half them. And finally, accelerated action to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, which, as one of our panelists we'll talk about in more detail, were more than $500 billion, more than $500 billion last year, and are 6 to 8 times, depending on which estimate you believe, than what goes into so-called subsidy for renewable energy. So the interesting fact there is that 15%, it seems, of our CO2 emissions today get a subsidy of $110 per ton. And the report, I thought, was very interesting when it mentioned that whereas renewables only 8% of the whereas only 8% are subject to a carbon price. $110 a ton, what could we not do with a carbon price of that actually imposed on it? And maybe some panelists will talk about it. So clearly this is a melange of a need, a call for fiscal instruments of all kinds, regulatory standards, taxes or market-based instruments. They're all going to have a role to play to manage emissions and implying some sort of price on carbon, both in terms of, I presume, some sort of a mission-driven approach, as we heard at lunch, as well as in a sort of a market or some ability to redirect flows towards green growth by pricing and hopefully addressing the environmental externalities that currently prevent us from achieving our goals. So I'll stop there, and I think you will hear sort of a lot of this addressed by our accomplished panelists. The first one, who I'm going to invite up, and I'll introduce them one at a time so you can actually connect them to who they are, is Dr. Dimitri Zengelis. I hope I pronounced that name reasonably correctly. Dimitri is a principal research fellow at the Grantham Research Institute at the LSE and an associate fellow at the Chatham House. He also headed the Stern review team and was a senior economist who worked with Lord Stern on now the seminal work that we all refer to as the Stern Report. So Dimitri is going to talk to us about market failures, about international policy coordination and cross-border competitiveness. So over to you, sir.
So from up there or over here?
Your choice. You have slides.
Driven by the technology. Kind of the inverse of what we would like to do, which is drive the technology. Okay, right. I'm going to have to do a little bit of desk clearing. Okay, just test that works. That does. Right, now, this presentation is probably slightly longer than 10 minutes if I were to do it in full, so I won't. The important thing is that we leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So I will sort of cherry pick the points that are of interest in the hope that either these presentations will be made public at the end, or if not, please do contact me and I will happily provide you with a copy. So here we go. Okay, fiscal instruments, well, they pretty much cover absolutely everything that governments do. They are tools used by governments to influence economic activity via budget, revenues, and expenditure. So I'm going to try and pick out 6 essential aims for which fiscal policy is applied. Fiscal policy is a source of directly funding public goods and services that would otherwise be underprovided by the market. Fiscal policy can be used to change behaviour by altering incentives. It can be used to send strategic signals and redirect resources, and I'll talk a little bit about how that slightly subtly differs from the previous bullet. It can be used to redistribute income, to influence aggregate demand, and it can be used for reasons that aren't necessarily in the public interest, reasons of political economy, paying off lobbies, vested interests and friends. And it's important that we are cognizant of that and say something about that as well in terms of optimal fiscal policy design. And what I want to do is examine these kind of key drivers in the context of green or resource-efficient transformation. Now, what I have done by moving is left my watch. Just about see that clock. Okay, that's okay. I can just about squint and see that clock over there. Right. So the first of those key elements of fiscal policy is to fund and directly provide public goods. I'm not really going to say very much about that here, except to say that you will need direct funding of things like funding networks, electricity grids, public transport, and so on. But also, in addition to that, I think the important thing that differentiates this from traditional forms of direct provision of public goods, we're talking about defense or security or firefighting, justice, street lighting, coast guards, whatever, is that this very much is driven by the dynamics of innovation and learning. So a lot of the direct public support will be in the form of R&D expenditure, research grants, deployment support, feed-in tariffs, and so on. So I think that's one of the defining characteristics of this particular, the green element, when it comes to the direct funding and provision of public goods. The next element is addressing market failures. Now, this isn't direct public spending. This is the use of other policies to influence, drive, and incentivize private behavior and expenditure. And there's a collection of market failures, each with their own policy tools and different instruments, but it's the collection that is mutually reinforcing. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the top bullet here, mispriced resources, and also the bottom bullet, utilizing savings and capital markets. It's obviously clear that if you're to overcome unsustainable resource use and excess consumption or the pollution of the commons, you have to price resources effectively. And that means, in the context of greenhouse gas emissions, either carbon taxes or cap and trade. They can be made very similar. For example, the problems of the volatility in the carbon price for cap and trade schemes such as the EU ETS can be alleviated through banking and borrowing, through price floors and ceilings, and through linking systems, ultimately internationally, in order to provide some stability. Other issues relating to areas and regions that apply carbon pricing, which trade with those that don't, so there are competitiveness issues relating to tradables, raise questions about border tariffs. These, I think, should be part of the tool mix, so long as they are non-discriminatory. They can be made more palatable for developing countries. One option, for example, is to recycle the revenue back to any country that isn't applying similar carbon standards to those countries that are exporting. Another option, which does violate to some extent the non-discrimination element, is maybe to link the size of those tariffs inversely to the income of the trading country, so that poor countries are exempt. The other area I want to focus on is the utilization of capital markets, and this is using fiscal instruments to steer capital into green sectors. We talked a little bit about that. Yesterday. It involves things like tax breaks, tax credits, but also instruments to try and promote commercial and retail savings, tax-favored global green finance funds, development support, and so on. The key here is that the public sector should take charge of elements of the policy risk which it controls. So a lot of this is about policy de-risking. It's about the public sector showing that it has some skin in the game in order to provide confidence to the private sector and leverage in some private capital. It involves risk sharing through guarantees, equity, feed-in tariffs, floors, as I said already, on carbon prices, a whole host of fiscal instruments that are relevant in this context. And the important thing when looking at all of these market failures, many of which I haven't talked about, R&D, for example, which I mentioned earlier, the important thing is that the sum is greater than the parts. So integrated policies must be coordinated, they must be clear and credible if they're to drive private finance. Muddled policy simply raises costs and raises risks. So it's, in a sense, it's a combination of demand pull, the creation of markets for green innovation and green investment, at the same time as supply push, steering private capital and reinforcing, and combining these two reinforcing catalysts from the supply side and the demand side. Now, the third area, which is similar to the previous one, I've just talked about how failing to correct market failures is to distort markets, so you're trying to make the markets work better, you're trying to make capitalism, if you like, work better, is subtly different. This is about policy that is not just supporting public goods and correcting market failures, but it's trying to create new markets through very clear policy signals, through making strategic choices. So the analogy I'm thinking of here might be the space race, the military-industrial complex, the war on cancer, all of which have had significant effect on inducing innovation and providing or boosting Schumpeterian creativity across a number of sectors. So it's slightly different to the more direct use of fiscal instruments to correct market failures. This is kind of going beyond market failures. And of course, it requires innovation in institutions as well. It's not just innovation in technologies. It really has to be about innovations in institutions. Innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. Innovation happens when you set a challenge. I used to advise Fiscal, and they used to tell me, the entrepreneurs used to say, look, if government doesn't ask, it will not get. Strategic fiscal instruments are necessary if, for example, China and India and other developing countries are to avoid locking into resource-extensive infrastructures, which they simply can't afford in the future. They don't have the luxury of being able to use fossil fuel to industrialize in the way that the West did in an environment where the resource scarcity is pushing up the cost of those resources. They don't have the luxury to build cities like Atlanta and Phoenix, which are based on extensive car use and suburbanization, for example, if they're to efficiently provide for their citizens. Redistribution of income, I think others, Mark and others will talk about, so in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that one. I will say something about the fifth element here, which is the use of fiscal instruments to supply, to influence aggregate demand, if only because it's particularly relevant in the current context. What these charts here show is something that people maybe don't know. We're all familiar with, and they're slightly fiddly charts, I apologize, but they show net balances in the private and public sector. The red line, which heads south in both the US, the UK, that you could apply this to a whole host of developed economies, is the fiscal deficits, which we're all familiar with, net imbalances, net borrowing in the public sector. What you see immediately is that it's mirrored by net lending from the private sector, which is the blue line. That's a matter of accounting identity. The public sector has to borrow from somewhere, so it either borrows from the private sector or it borrows from abroad, and that's the green line, which is the current account deficit. Now, that's barely shifted. So what we have in the US and the UK is this record level of net private savings sloshing around. Now, both an exogenous change in either of those balances will breed this symmetrical response from the other side, but the causality in this case goes from private to public. It's because the private sector has started saving in an environment of lack of confidence. Households have started saving, banks have retrenched on credit, businesses have cut back on employment and investment, that net saving has gone up, and the public sector's picked up the tab because revenues have gone down and so on. And the reason we know it's gone from private to public is because real risk-free interest rates have gone to zero and below. They've picked up a little bit in the last few weeks, but clearly there's been a dumping of ex-ante desired saving over desired investment. Those savings don't have to make returns of zero in real interest over the next 20 years. They can be put to more productive use, and I think there's a real role here for green fiscal instruments to make use of those surplus savings by restoring confidence through credible long-term signals, which the private sector will buy because it's not willing to invest in private markets because it's not confident enough. But a green transformation has the scale and the legacy, and combined with public support, could trigger substantial investment, which will have repercussions for jobs, for growth. And that investment doesn't just have to be in developed countries, it can be in developing countries. And finally, the last of my 6 elements, fiscal instruments and the political economy. And I think here the important thing to recognize is if we're talking about the green economy, we are talking about the need for some kind of public intervention to overcome market failures, to set strategic signals. But we need to be cognizant of the fact that public intervention can lead to inefficiency, it can lead to market distortions, and it can, in particular, lead to scope for rent-seeking and lobbying by vested interests. So we want to avoid replacing market failure by policy failure, which puts the onus on policy being transparent, utilizing market instruments, and taking advantage of competition where possible. The other element of the political economy, which is very important, is we have to be clear that this isn't all win-win. There will be dislocation, and the losers are easy to identify. They know exactly who they are. The potential winners tend to be highly diffuse, they're all of us, and just that, potential, in many cases, new innovators who have yet to appear on the scene. So there is an asymmetry of political influence, which breeds this rather powerful merchant of doubt industry, which we're all familiar with, which has held back progress on climate action. So we need to understand the political economy of change, but also recognize that people are ready to act responsibly if they understand the scale of the risk, and Nick mentioned this yesterday, and have a clear line of sight as to what can be done. And this means we need a degree of open discussion and engagement, building on the common understanding, which will make democratic choice more effective. So many of the barriers which fiscal instruments have to confront are cultural or institutional or political rather than technological or economic. And that's the frustration we all face. The science and economics tends to be rather clearer than the politics. So to conclude, I won't read through my conclusion, but I will cut to the bottom line, both literally and metaphorically, and that is that there is no shortage of private saving in the current market, but there is a very clear lack of perceived opportunity. And I think fiscal instruments have an integral role in trying to overcome that obstacle. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
I need to hand the baton on to somebody.
Yeah, Dr. Ahmed here. Thanks a lot for that, Dr. Zengalis. And we now have Dr. Ehtisham Ahmed, who's a senior fellow for the Center for Economic Research at the University of Bonn, at the Asia Research Center at the London School of Economics. He's written widely on public policy and fiscal reforms, governance, and poverty reduction. He will talk to us about incentives and optimal tax approaches to carbon and the environment. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you, Vikram. I'm waiting for my presentation. I'm going to talk very specifically about carbon taxes. And it's based on work that Nick Stern and I have been doing since the early 80s on optimal tax approaches to public policy. We started working in India and in Mexico in the 80s, and this is just an extension of that work. It builds on a paper that we had done for the Bakshi Festschrift around 2008. And what's interesting is that it was picked up as a policy tool in two countries, in Pakistan and Mexico. So those were also countries we had worked on in the 1980s. And what's interesting is that there are some unintended consequences of public policy. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Key issue with carbon taxes is that they generally affect intermediate goods. And you have to work through the effects on the prices of final goods through the production chain. So if you impose a carbon tax, you're effectively imposing a wedge on the prices of most goods in the economy that use carbon inputs. And the idea, of course, is that it would affect consumer behavior. It would also force changes in production behavior, that there would be short-term adjustments, but that the resources that are generated through the carbon tax would be used to facilitate the changes that would be needed in both production and compensation for consumers. There are difficulties when it comes to multi-level countries, that's India, Pakistan, Mexico, who imposes the tax, and is it sustainable to give it to the lower levels of government, which is often where most of the information and the need for adjustment arise. So the difficulty quite often is that if a single jurisdiction in a country, state in Mexico or a state in India, imposes a carbon tax and others don't, you can lose business to people in the neighboring jurisdiction. And it's the same problem for countries in isolation. If one country imposes a tax, it basically affects its productive capacity and possibly disadvantages its exports in relation to other countries. So that's the constraint. Again, as I said, the methodology is based on work that Stern and I had done in the early 80s. What we had shown was that the tax, of course, is a function, and I will not talk about the details here. The model is in the paper or in the presentation. I'll talk about a result. Now, if you look at the row 1, which is the top row, it gives you the welfare loss by imposing a rupee of taxation on different classes of goods. And the columns are degrees of inequality aversion. So if you take the degree of inequality aversion at 0, that is, everyone is treated the same, you would tax things like wheat. But what's interesting is that item 10, which is fuel and light, becomes very attractive to tax the moment you have a degree of inequality aversion, even at a small one. So it's actually a very good item to tax from a distributional perspective, from a production perspective. As I said, Pakistan had picked up the idea in 2009 with the IMF program. They put in a carbon tax. It was a carbon levy. They fixed the differential between the then market price, internationally determined, and the domestic price, and then allowed the domestic price to vary as the international price. So basically, they created a wedge above the international price, which was a good thing. But they didn't use the resources to either fix the electricity grid or provide restructuring resources for industry. So effectively, what they did was impose a wedge on domestic industry, which was compensated because the industry was owned by people who were very close to the government, was compensated by tax breaks in other instruments. So even though they had imposed a carbon tax, the total revenue GDP ratio declined, more than offsetting the carbon tax. So you had the situation where the total revenue take actually went down as a result of the carbon tax, and that then generated a huge problem with the production of electricity. The electricity grid came to a halt. A huge element of circular debt has built up. And of course, a lot of this is due to the fact that you have holes in the rest of the tax system, which you can drive trucks through. So people were cheating. With the tax on tax interaction, they were cheating even more. So you have, and this is the point that Nick was making yesterday, you shouldn't just look at one tax instrument in isolation. You need to be looking at the interaction of all sets of taxes. So the tax on carbon in this particular case just made matters worse. Now, the example of the intergovernmental aspect is also very interesting. In the Mexican case, you have had, over a period of years, a centrally determined tax on automobile use, which was implemented by the states, but legislated by the federal government of Mexico. In 2008, following recommendations from a fund bank team, they decided to make local governments more responsible by giving them also the responsibility for setting of rates. They were, in any case, carrying out the administration. But the moment they got the rate-setting capabilities, they stopped using it. And now, of course, motor vehicle tax is a very good tax. It's very progressive. It's hugely important from the environmental perspective. But because the cars just moved to the neighboring jurisdiction, they were unable to, the competition across jurisdictions meant that this tax just collapsed. So in a sense, what we're seeing in this particular case is very interesting. They didn't use the taxes which they had access to, largely because they were able to go to the federal government in Mexico City and get what is called gap-filling fiscal transfers. You run a deficit. My good friend Govinda Rao in India has talked about fiscal dentistry. You run a deficit, you go and get some more money from the Federal Ministry of Finance. If you can do that, there is no incentive for you to impose pain on your own jurisdiction. So the tax collapsed. So I think what these two examples I wanted to use as illustrations is that you have to think through the whole policy matrix in imposing a tax like a carbon tax. And what would that be? Now, of course, in the case of the tenencia, which is the tax on vehicles, you have to go back to some sort of band. There has to be a minimum set by the Federation and some possibility of those jurisdictions that need more money to impose more. And you have to do something on the transfer side. You have to block the fiscal dentistry. If you can't block the fiscal dentistry, there's no point giving local jurisdictions the right to levy these types of taxes. So in addition to that, you would want to change the basis of the way the automobile tax is, of course, legislated. So what we see is that the design of the carbon tax at both the national and subnational level is something of a microcosm of what you have at the international level, that countries really cannot impose these taxes if they're afraid that their competitors are not going to impose them. It imposes a disability on the country that imposes it or on a local jurisdiction that imposes it. And therefore, to prevent the race to the bottom, you do need coordinated global action or coordinated national action, depending on what sort of tax you have. And you want to make sure that you use the additional revenues to improve the grid or to assist in the restructuring of industry so as to make it more efficient. Otherwise, you just end up making the existing industry even more inefficient than it already is. And of course, you need some compensation mechanisms to protect the poor. There's been talk about the conditional cash transfers like Oportunidades in Mexico, or you've got Benazir Income Support Program in Pakistan. And you've got these conditional cash transfers sprouting up everywhere that the World Bank is giving advice. And the problem is that most of these conditional cash transfers are designed for permanent poverty relief. These are not necessarily relevant for those people who are going to be affected by a carbon tax, because most of the people affected by a carbon tax are going to be your urban middle class people and not your very poor people in the rural areas that these conditional cash transfers are typically geared towards. So you have to be very careful about gainers and losers and make sure you're compensating the right people and not to keep providing additional money for people who don't need it, and you create a poverty trap, as you've seen in the Mexican case. So I'll stop there. It's a case of being careful about a carbon tax and being aware that the overall policy framework that you're using is relevant and should be taken into consideration as you design it and as you use economic theory and policy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Ahmed, on that, giving us an in-depth perspective after the earlier presentation had provided the context. And I think what's going to be interesting is, after hearing about unintended consequences of public policy and the allocation of tax revenues, we're going to have Dr. I should have confirmed how you pronounce your last name, but Halle. I just wanted Dr. Mark Halle, who's with the International Institute for Sustainable Development as the Executive Director of its European organization, and the Global Director for Trade and Investment. He was the founder of the Board for International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development, and he's quite the authority on what he's going to talk to us about, which is fossil fuel subsidies and the flip of maybe perhaps of what we heard around carbon taxes in some ways. So take it away, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikram, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We tend, when we look at the challenge of transitioning to a green economy, to look at new things that we need to put in place, new incentives, new taxes, new measures that need to be taken so that the incentives are right to move to a green economy more quickly than we otherwise would. And we tend to forget that there are a lot of things that are in place now that are actually tripping up or slowing down the transition that we all want to see. And I'm going to talk about one of those today. It's the case of fossil fuel subsidies. And the issuance of the report yesterday by the International Energy Agency is just one piece of evidence that this issue is coming very solidly to the floor and being discussed at an intensity that would have been unimaginable a few years ago. And so I want to look at why we should focus on fossil fuel subsidy reform if we are interested in green growth and a green economy. First, of course, is the numbers, and Vikram gave you some in his introduction. This is prior to the report that just came out, but it's very close to the numbers. We're looking, and this is, remember, just consumption subsidies in 37 developing countries, and we're already over $500 million of money spent. The consequence of this is that we are headed on a track for $660 billion by 2020, but that if we were able to affect that curve, if we were able to reform subsidies in a big way, this could make a major contribution to the climate change goals that we're all trying to pursue. So let me deconstruct that just a little. And sorry, I should say the last thing, if you add consumption and production subsidies by OECD countries, you add 55 to 90 billion to that overall number. And I'll come back to that to put that number in perspective. So governments are spending 409 billion subsidizing fossil fuel consumption in 2010. And the general reason given is that the cost of energy is a huge burden on the poor and is keeping them poor. But in fact, only 8% of this subsidy actually goes to the poorest 20% of the population. And if you look across the world, you will find that that number is pretty consistent, that the 43% of fossil fuel subsidies go to the top 20%, the top quintile of the richest people in society. And only a small proportion goes to the poorest. So the general argument made for fossil fuel subsidies, which is to give relief to the poor, actually doesn't hold up to close examination. But on top of that, we are subsidizing exploration and production of fuel at the cost of something close to or something approaching $100 billion a year. And these are figures that we have painstakingly put together and haven't been properly challenged. And these subsidies, of course, give a strong incentive to continue on an economy based on carbon fuels. It raises barriers to renewable energy, and it locks in investments in fossil energy infrastructure that leave us with a heritage problem when we get to the point politically where we are ready to reform. And we talk about policy consistency, the need for policy coherence. We talk about the need for a clear message sent out to the market, to investors. And yet, we're talking on the one hand of taxing carbon, and on the other hand, we are providing hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies to fossil fuels. So there is a total policy incoherence in the present setup. Calculations have been made by IEA and OECD that show that if we remove fossil fuel subsidies, we can reduce global carbon emissions by 5.8% by 2035, and OECD says by 10% by 2050. So the prospect of reform to fossil fuel subsidies that are out there installed, being paid today, could take us a long way towards the climate action goals that the international community has set for ourselves and that we now know are extremely urgent to realize. And of course, it would level the playing field for renewable energy technologies, allowing their deployment to take place at a much quicker rate. Now, we all know that reforming fossil fuel subsidies is a good idea, but it's difficult. And generally, it's because the argument for reform tends to be put in ways that don't appeal to politicians or the public. We rarely talk about fossil fuel subsidy reform in terms of opportunity costs, but the opportunity costs are actually very real. We say we need to take away the fossil fuel subsidy or reduce the fossil fuel subsidy because the burden on our economy is too great, because the debt is too great. But the voting populace just sees it as, you used to give us something, now you want to take it away, and you expect us to be pleased by it. But if we actually recast it in a different way, saying, if our objective is to move to a green economy, here is a source of money which, if released into the economy, could be used to put in place infrastructure, put in place social safety nets, replace private transport by public transport, or replace no transport by public transport, reduce school fees, improve rural health care. All of these are very real because these are funds being spent or not being collected by treasuries that, if collected, could be used for other public policy purposes. And we feel that you'd have a far better chance of selling fossil fuel subsidy reform if you put it in terms of opportunity costs. We can subsidize fossil fuels, or we could do this. What do you prefer? And of course, it allows investment in longer-term development priorities, including putting in place the kind of infrastructure we need to set in place a green economy. So fossil fuel subsidies, I think, as everybody knows, encourage wasteful consumption. If you lower the price of something, you encourage greater consumption of it. And if you look at it in terms of reducing global primary energy demand, if we were able to remove the subsidies that are in place today, as you can see on the graph, you could cut global primary energy demand by 5% by 2020. And a lot of this would cut down on wasteful consumption. This gives the areas in which the savings can be realized. The overwhelming majority or the high majority is with transport, but there are great opportunities also with building and with industry. And if we phased out energy subsidies, this could cut global oil demand by 4.7 million barrels per day by 2020, most of it in the transport sector. And of course, as I said before, eliminating subsidies to fossil fuels could be a key step towards tackling climate change. And here you have that graph of the no subsidy phase out scenario in dark blue and a subsidy removal in the paler blue. And it would result in a 5.8% lowering of carbon emissions, or 2 gigatons by 2020. So we're talking about a serious contribution towards climate change. Looked at another way, if you look at our current scenario in the red line and the scenario required by policies that would stabilize global carbon dioxide at 450 parts per million, the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies by 2020 could provide 20% of the abatement needed to move on to that trajectory. So on the one hand, we are spending billions to give people incentives to prefer carbon-based fuels over the alternatives, and yet stopping to do that would make a major contribution to reaching our climate change goals. And going back a last time to this whole question of who benefits, this is a series of graphs that look at subsidies to different fossil fuels, and in the blue slice of the cake, you show the proportion of the subsidy that's actually benefiting the poorest 20% of the income of the population. And you will find that there are only 8% on average of the 409 billion spent on fossil fuel subsidies in 2010 that went to the lower incomes. Now, Edson Ahmed talked about the difficulty of reform and put it quite correctly in terms of the political economy. Reforming fossil fuel subsidies is both an art and a science, and you have to prepare it properly. And we are always very careful to say that whereas we would like fossil fuel subsidies to be removed, how they're removed will make an enormous difference to the success of the programs and the impact that they finally have. But I think that what we have in place now is a massive incentive in our economies to give preference to carbon-based fuels over the alternatives at a time when everybody knows we need to wean ourselves off the carbon economy. And we cannot go on doing that. So I think that if we look at the range of fiscal instruments available or potentially available to help us in the transition through to a green economy, and if we look at the tools that are available to address the really frightening scenarios of climate change, we cannot help but focus on the potential that is there if we are able to remove these subsidies. And the final point I'll make is that there is a great deal happening now on this subject. 5 years ago, almost nobody was talking about it. Now it appears all the time in the policy speeches of some of our great economic world leaders. The G20 has picked up a weak commitment. APEC has matched that weak commitment. Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform has been created and is gathering countries. The World Bank has established this as one of the new president's highest priorities. So there is a movement towards success, and I think that we are close to a tipping point where, looking back 10, 20 years from now, we'll say, how could we be so stupid as to have maintained those crazy economic policies in place for so long? Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was quite the expose, and I think you closed well as to maybe we don't have to wait 10, 20 years to figure out why we are being so crazy about it. We'll hopefully explore that a little more in the discussions. And last, certainly not least, Rod Hilton, who is the Assistant Director General for the Australian, the Assistant Director General for the International Development Policy and Financing at the Australian Agency for International Development. As part of his role, he leads on the engagement with global development funds, is Australia's alternate board member for the Green Climate Fund. Rod's going to tell us more about Australia's carbon price and the international activities to promote fiscal instruments that are conducive to green growth. Thank you, Rod.
Thank you very much, and probably just to acknowledge my fellow presenters, it's kind of a bit of an honour for me to be on quite a distinguished panel today, and I fear my presentation may be a little bit more pedestrian, so I'll try and fly through it so we can get to some good questions for everybody. So the focus of the presentation today, I think I'll keep it at first to what Australia has done around its carbon pricing mechanism, but just to flag with you too, I'm available to talk about some of our activities abroad in trying to encourage some of the development of fiscal instruments for green growth as well. So this first chart, I mean, we can skip through this quite quickly, is basically just to demonstrate that Australia is facing a very significant challenge, whichever sort of emissions pathway we need to follow. So whether it's a low, medium or high ambition, Australia needs to do quite a lot. So the challenge for the government is to come up with an efficient and effective mechanism to do so. So in thinking through that issue, the government sort of came to the conclusion that they would use a fixed price, in the first phase, a fixed price emissions trading scheme, moving to a fully flexible emissions trading scheme from 2015. The principles upon which they made that decision were basically the efficiency associated with that, utilising a market to allocate emissions, leading to least cost abatement. Second is the certainty in being able to achieve targets. That's very important, especially given our international commitments. And the third, which is probably equally important, is the flexibility of such a scheme, flexibility to become more adaptable. Sorry, is that better? Flexibility to become more adaptable and respond to changes in both the science and the economics. So a quick run through of some of the government modelling on this. So the chart on your left, or I think it's on your left, which is the impact of Australia's carbon price on GNI per person. So as you can see, it's quite a minimal economic impact. There is a cost. However, the right-hand side shows the significant benefit that we can gain, which is a vast reduction in our emissions. It's probably important to highlight here too, which is a point I think Nicholas Stern was making last night, that the carbon pricing mechanism isn't the only instrument we look to engage in this sort of transition. In fact, we're using the carbon pricing mechanism to help price emissions, but a lot of the revenue from that is also helping to fund some of these other instruments, whether it be our Clean Energy Finance Corporation, some of our renewable energy promotion, energy efficiency measures as well. And it's a very important relationship, and very much as the government was developing this, they were thinking about how this could be part of a multifaceted strategy, and that's an important consideration. So how's it gone? It's awfully hard to report on something that's been around only for, well, it's in its first year still, but just to give you an indication, and obviously these factors, other factors would play into these results, but over the first 6 months, emissions have fallen in all sectors facing a carbon price. The first 10 months versus the previous year, 11 million tonnes less emissions were used in our national electricity market, reflecting about a 7.3% reduction. There was a 5.1% reduction in the emissions intensity of electricity generation and a 7.3% reduction in coal-fired electricity generation. There was a lot of debate about what the impact on the economy would be. So to give you a sense of the economic indicators, at least to date, we've still experienced a 3.1% increase in GDP in Australia. There has been a 75% increase in our renewable energy investment. The first 9 months versus the previous year, 160,000 jobs were added. We experienced an inflation rate of about 2.5%. And then if you look at the first 10 months versus the previous year, we still had a 25% increase in Australian shares and a 28% increase in renewable generation. Again, I don't want to claim the carbon price led to all of this, but that was just more the context of sometimes impacts can be overstated when we're talking about some of these instruments as well. It's very much a staged process of introducing Australia's emissions trading scheme. If you look back, which is often a step in the process I think we neglect or fail to talk about enough, is there was a very important phase in 2008 to 9 where a number of reporting and regulatory frameworks were put in place. So we had the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme and our National Registry of Emissions Units put in place. And before a price was added to that, companies were able to make sure the systems were up and running and they were able to report on that. That very much helped us when we got around to implementing the carbon price and moving to the fixed price period, which we are currently in. So that's a fixed price period that runs out to 14-15. From then we move into a flexible price period with price ceiling. There's a link to the Kyoto market and partial linking to the EU ETS, which I'll get to in a second. And then from 2018-19 we have a fully flexible emissions trading scheme with a full link to the EU ETS and a link to the Kyoto market. Some design principles which I thought were helpful to highlight here. Basically, administrative simplicity, credible institutions, environmental integrity, economic efficiency and awareness of distributional impacts. I just thought they were a nice little set of principles. That's how we applied them to Australia's carbon pricing mechanism, but I think for a set of principles on how you might evaluate fiscal instruments in trying to achieve green growth, they're not a bad list to run through in sort of evaluating what you can and can't achieve. And there'll always be trade-offs and balances between each instrument. Another important point for us in designing the carbon pricing mechanism was linking it to existing frameworks that were out there. That was done largely for administrative simplicity, but also to ensure that we could reduce the compliance burden as far as possible on companies. Just a quick slide on the coverage of the scheme. The scheme that I've been talking about at the moment covers about 66% of our domestic emissions. That's an equivalent, which is an interesting statistic, so that sounds like an awful lot of your economy, but given how our economy is structured, that means the carbon price actually only applies to 0.025% of actively trading businesses in our economy. Actually, that's only about 325 entities. So for all the bluster about it, it actually is applying only to a few smaller number of companies. Just to highlight too, which is my point before, so while the carbon price covers about 66% of our economy, there's a couple of ways we are implementing the carbon price. One is under the carbon price mechanism, which I've largely been talking about. But we're also putting an equivalent carbon price on our synthetic greenhouse gases and non-transport uses of gaseous fuels. We're doing that through legislation. The reason we're doing that was we had legislation in place already for those items, so it was much easier to just work with those existing systems and put a carbon price through that was equivalent to the carbon pricing mechanism, then bring them into that. Liquid fuels currently have a choice to opt in to our scheme too, so they could move outside of the fuel taxation system and opt into a carbon pricing mechanism. Again, that's designed to give businesses a rationale or the flexibility to decide what was best for them in their circumstances. Governance, again, the importance of this can't be overstated, so just to run through very quickly for you. The government and parliament, obviously there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of economics to all of these things, so the government and parliament clearly maintain the ability to make the major changes to the scheme. However, we also have a clean energy regulator which looks after our carbon pricing mechanism, a climate change authority which is going to track how the mechanism is working and recommend the pollution caps that we will apply in the future. Plus we also have a productivity commission that will report back on some of our industry assistance measures. And on that, which is my point before about being aware of your distributional impacts, revenue from the carbon price is used to help support both household and industry during the imposition of the carbon price, at least in the early phases. Some of that is involved in investment programs for energy efficiency, and that's run through a competitive grant scheme. There's also a competitive grant scheme for R&D and early commercialisation of technologies within industry. For emissions intensive trade exposed companies, there are free permit allocations that decline over time with a carbon productivity factor of about 1.3% to try and install an incentive for companies to improve their performance without sort of offering them too much pain up front. So if we can quickly get to how we're sort of working with the international market. So in recent years, at least it appears to us, the progress towards global emissions trading in a top-down approach has stalled, or at least is not progressing as fast as hoped. But there seems to be a groundswell of progress towards domestic national schemes. So it's a much more bottom-up driven approach, and we're just sort of using this slide to highlight that if that continues, very much we see the potential for those domestic schemes to link up into an international market, so that's a trend we'd like to encourage. It's a trend we'd like to encourage for three reasons. I mean, it's basic economics, of course. The gains from the trade occur due to differences in marginal abatement costs between countries. Linking will help stabilise the carbon price signals to the market through broader participation and help reduce the likelihood of price distortions, and there will be an ability to hedge risk, manage your carbon exposure, and ultimately to contribute to a more uniform carbon price internationally. This is just our progression to full linking, which I touched on before, and I think that's about my 10 minutes, so I think I'll leave it there and happy to discuss further some of those issues, or indeed what we're doing internationally.
Thanks a lot, Rod. I think I'm going to just sort of pick up on how you ended, and then you talked about, and for me, some of you who I've engaged with in the past, I'm a big proponent of market-based mechanisms, but at the same time, I'm also realistic enough to realize that we're not going to necessarily get to our end goals where we are. I mean, in the ideal world, we have these fragmented, heterogeneous markets regionally, nationally. Everybody has carbon, some sort of carbon pricing mechanism. Dozens of different asset classes are created. We find a way of figuring out how we're going to swap one for the other, and we somehow get to a global carbon currency that then permeates into every decision we make. Okay, so that's not happening in 2020. Across the four, and we want to leave some time for Q&A, so I'm not going to, but I'd just like to draw out in the context of, say, the IEA discussion, and let's just pick energy efficiency. Energy efficiency, and forgive me for those who don't know when I refer to the so-called McKinsey cost curve, but there's a marginal abatement cost curve out there that, in whatever form you look at, shows a big, huge left side that's below zero in terms of savings. We all know a lot of reasons that it takes more capital to unlock those savings, but it exists version after version. We heard references to wasteful consumption, unintended consequences of certain tax regimes, fiscal instruments used possibly to change behaviour, as well as demonstrated in the Australian context, some innovation in terms of institutions in order to do that. So given that I have this very captive panel with a lot of accomplished people on it, I want to ask all of you sort of the same question, and take it as you will. But if you were given a clean piece of paper, and like I said, just linking to the IEA report this morning of how imperative it is that we change behavior on energy efficiency, what would be your top 2 or 3 things that you would recommend that either be eliminated or introduced in a context, especially, let's say, a developing country that wants to put itself on a somewhat more sustainable green growth? So I want to leave it pretty open-ended, but I want you to actually give us your prescription for what it would take to unlock what we have all struggled with but know is a gold mine out there. So I don't want to go in any order. If anybody wants to take it, if you want to start us off, Mark, that'll be great. Thank you.
I take it I'm not allowed to say reform fossil fuel subsidies. I think I probably
okay. That's number 1. Then we need number 2 and 3 from you as well.
Okay, so I think
and if you don't mind explaining why and how you think that'll
Sure.
do it, that'll be useful for all of us.
So this is relevant to subsidy reform, but it's also relevant to a lot of other areas that relate to climate change and green growth. And that is, we tend to not pay nearly enough attention to what I call policy alignment. So if you take the issue of subsidies, there's no reason why a government shouldn't put a subsidy in place. There's nothing fundamentally illegitimate about the use of a subsidy as a policy tool. But you have to ask yourself the question, given the policy goal that's been set, is this the best or most efficient, in your terms, is this the most efficient instrument to get us there? And that question is very rarely asked. And it's very rarely asked because people don't want the answer that they would obviously get. So if in India they subsidized kerosene to give access to the rural poor, access to electricity by the rural poor, you have to ask yourself, and it's a perfectly good public policy goal, helping the rural poor get energy access, but is the subsidy the best way of doing it? And secondly, is it having the impact that we want it to have? And the answer, if you look closely, is that there are probably 10 policy instruments, including cash transfers, that would work better for that specific public policy goal. And secondly, actually, the energy is not going to the rural poor. It tends to be captured by the middle class, those who have power in the economy and can capture rents. So I think that there needs to be a great deal more attention to what actually happens and the extent to which public policy is served by the instrument that's put in place. Another example, the US biofuel subsidy. It was sold on 2 grounds. One was helping fight atmospheric carbon. Well, our calculations show that the US biofuel subsidy avoided atmospheric carbon at the price of $800 to $1,000 a ton. So you can do it. It's just a very poor policy instrument, and there are many others available. So that's the first. The second is to pay far more attention to the governance of the thing. And both Dimitri and Edson made that point very strongly, that you can take a policy instrument in isolation and examine it and find it to be wonderful and multifaceted and beautiful. It's how it's actually implemented in the broader scheme of things that makes the difference whether it works or doesn't work. And in the end, we have to ask ourselves, what works best? That gets to your efficiency point.
And I think very much in that sense, the work that Stern and I did on optimal taxes essentially takes the price that you would want to increase relative to each class of goods. So what we come up with is actually a positive tax on energy items if you are interested in the welfare of the poor. And that involves, of course, moving to international prices, which is getting rid of your implicit subsidy and imposing a positive tax. Now, the question is, can you actually do it properly and within a context that isn't then offset by the political economy holes in the rest of the tax system? Because if you do that, then you have interactions with other taxes, and you've had, as we've seen in the Pakistan case, a collapse of the tax system together with a collapse in the energy generation. So you've got brownouts, you haven't had enough investment because there's been a collapse of the revenue base, and the rich producers who are also were very close to the political parties in power basically have their cake and eating it too. So in a sense, the political economy actually should be to do all the things, which is the tax reform, together with the compensation mechanisms, together with the investment that is needed in generating cleaner energy and providing for continued supplies as a package. Because if you do it partially, then even though you might be moving in the right direction, it can backfire.
Yeah, go ahead. Can I, before you do, can I just interject one more thing, and you can ignore it or what, but as Shami mentioned investment, I'm sure we'll get a question from the audience around mobilizing investments. Yes, Sean, I look at you. But I'm just curious, and if you feel free to sort of ignore this and go back to the original or somehow play with this. We talk about taxes. We talk about sort of from a perspective of trying to minimize the use of a bad, if you will. But how about a fiscal instrument? And I'm not the economist who can, public economist who can design this, but what about like a development or a climate dividend? I mean, that allows for a reward other than simply, you know, the monetary reward to be actually cashed out. Are markets, carbon markets and price emissions trading schemes the only way to do that? Or are there other ways of capturing what I think you said in terms of utilizing the savings in capital markets and domestic capital markets and somehow linking it to the removing the lack from the opportunity and somehow bringing them together in a way that mobilizes domestic funding for domestic development rather than sort of addressing certain other issues in terms of mobilizing money from abroad as well. So
we've collected two questions. So let me have a quick crack at the first, and
sure.
I might sort of just give some initial thoughts on the second. On the first, I mean, you know, on energy efficiency, pricing mechanisms clearly will have a role to play, but one of the defining features, almost, if you like, if you think in the context of the McKinsey curve and that sort of negative cost space, is precisely that those areas aren't very price sensitive, right? If they were price sensitive in principle, they wouldn't exist. So I think it's actually very difficult to say, well, here's one or two kind of golden bullet type policies, precisely because those types of inefficiencies are riddled with specific complexities. There's probably a policy tool that fits the particular market failure, but it has to be bespoke designed. So it may be a question of access to finance. A lot of the poorest can't afford either the capital or the infrastructure that is actually most efficient in the long run. So you end up saddled with wasteful capital. In terms of households, often it's either access to information or it might be asymmetric information, for which the response might be better placed in terms of a regulatory framework. I don't know. I mean, so when I go and buy a fridge, for the most part, I'll probably pick the one that looks nicest, that is cheapest. I won't have a little sort of calculator to figure out the payback period and work out that actually the more expensive one would have saved me more money over this period, discounted at a personal discount rate of X means that the net present value is. Now, consumers don't do that. So actually, I would be quite happy for government to step in, save me the wasted time by just getting rid of the inefficient fridges. I actually see that not as a restriction of liberty and choice. It's actually, it saves me time and enhances my choice as a consumer. So there'll be different policy tools, I think, for different market failures. For producers, it might be something to do with governance. It might be to do with the nature of the relationship between shareholders and long-run versus short-run returns, and so on. So there will be different tools that need to be applied. On the investment side, I think that the biggest deterrent to investment in this space is not that the private sector in most cases doesn't get that this will be a profitable sector, that we will transition to a low carbon resource efficient economy and that there will be growth opportunities. I think most private players will say yes, but we're not sure it's going to happen just yet. I mean, look at the policy signals. There's muddle and uncertainty. And even though we're going to make money out of this, we think we can make money out of this in the longer term. Right now, is it worth the cost and pain of the change, of changing our technologies, of reskilling our workforce, of rerouting our supply lines, etc., etc.? And many of them say, well, actually, you know what? Until the policy frameworks are clear and the policy risk is diminished, we will wait. We're not saying no, we're just saying not now. Well, of course, when everybody says not now, nothing happens, and that prophecy that things aren't moving fast enough becomes self-fulfilling. So we don't reach that threshold, that critical mass, or actually the payoff to moving as a private investor is much higher than the payoff to actually either holding back or putting your investment elsewhere. I think it's that policy needs to aim at, and that's about de-risking policy risk, primarily.
So I think I'd strongly agree with the interventions from the other speakers, so I'll try and distinguish mine a little bit and say, along with those things, especially in the context of energy efficiency or other measures to promote green growth in developing countries, I think you need to consider two things. I mean, I think in many respects we have the theory, we have the policy tools. We keep talking about we need innovation in that respect, but they're solid theories, they're solid policy tools. They are there and they are in existence right now. So the question, therefore, we really have to ask ourselves is, why aren't we achieving that uptake? So two points I'll make. The first is, I think we need to make a far greater effort at trying to achieve country level or community level ownership of some of these activities. I think in many respects it is very easy to think that if only we could demonstrate how wonderful this instrument was, the uptake will be great and that'll be fine, without sort of doing that. And it can often be grinding work without putting people on the ground and really explaining how these instruments work and why they'll be of benefit. Trying to get over some of the information barriers. Try and change cultural, psychological behaviour. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we need to do that, and we need to get in and really get country and community ownership of some of those initiatives. The second is we often overlook the capacity because we just believe that this system will be able to go in, be implemented, and it'll all be fine. And some things, they're very simple things. So we need to look at the supporting systems for any instrument that you want to put in, whether that's the people, whether that's infrastructure, whether that's even your ability to monitor, report and verify things. They all need to be in place, and often we tend to look at the systems only after the instrument. So I'd encourage a greater look at the capacity. I mean, one thing, for example, is in the South Pacific, you can look at sort of replacing, they have a very high dependence on diesel. You look at replacing that with solar panels, and there's some very successful programs doing that. There's some less successful ones doing that because there's no one that can maintain them. But you can find 10 people on the island that can maintain a diesel generator. So you've got to look at the sustainability of those systems as well, and I think that's important. On your second question, just an initial thought, again, which is related to the points I was just making, I think I very much agree that it's different policy instruments for different challenges, and that can apply not only to different market failures, but that'll apply to different countries, cultures, and all of that too. So I don't think we need to be too prescriptive. I think we have the suite. We just need to get in and have the conversation.
Arise from my fellow speakers, and I just want to underline them because I think they're important. One is something that Rod said from the Australian experience, which is that phase of field testing the new system. I think that's something that not enough countries do. They design it, then they sort of pull back the curtains and say, here it is. And without sort of taking it out on the road and seeing whether it actually functions reasonably well and what the problems are. And I think there's a big lesson to be learned there. Second is something that you said, which is we tend to ignore that these policy innovations don't leave behind simply winners. They not only leave behind losers, but they leave behind sometimes very considerable stranded assets. And until we are able to acknowledge that and find a way of dealing with it, it doesn't mean compensating everybody or writing down their investments. It means putting them into categories. Some, sorry, you're just going to have to leave behind. Some, you can transfer them into the new economy in a very positive way. There are various ways of dealing with it, but I think the sort of political resistance that we see, for example, to subsidy reform, a lot of it comes from the fact that we simply refuse to say, actually, this isn't good for everybody.
Hey, it looks like the start of a very interesting debate. I, for one, would love to delve into it deeper, but I'm cognizant of both time and fairness, so I'm going to just turn it over to the audience and see if we had a couple of questions that we could try and get the panel. There's one hand there, one at the back, and then one right in front. And maybe if you take all three together, that way we can try and the panel address it, and we call it time. So you have a question too? You have to be able to give it an opportunity as the owner of the session. So if you don't mind identifying yourself and just going for it, please.
Yeah, I'm Peter King, Senior Policy Advisor with the Institute for Global Environment Strategies. I want to particularly pick up on this issue of de-risking policy, which I think is absolutely critical. We've heard this repeated in nearly all of the sessions over the past day and a half, how important this is. And yet, when you think about it, the global lobby industry is about $200 billion a year. It has an enormous influence in creating the uncertainty about the need for change. About the need for change now and the urgency of change. Are there any sort of thoughts about possible restrictions on creating this air of uncertainty, which the lobbyists are being paid extremely well to protect the industries that perceive themselves to be losers as a green economy begins to emerge?
Sure. Sean Kidney from Climate Bonds Initiative. Thank you. Thank you for a meaty panel. A lot of time panels are a bit thin. This has been a very good one. Risk mitigation is obviously critically important because of the scale and speed, the novelty of what we have to do from an investment perspective. There is simply no way that we can fund it all using traditional financial means because of that reason. There's just no history. So we need to bear that in mind, which means we've got to mitigate policy risk, which is fundamentally because it's a policy-driven change. That's just something that has to permeate everything. But of course, the detail is interesting and deserves some investigation. But I actually want to talk about complexity theory, which is to respond to your energy efficiency comment and ask a question whether people agree or not. It seems to me that energy efficiency, we're blinded by old-fashioned approaches to choice theory. That is maximum consumer choice, which actually leads to paralysis. In the energy efficiency space, we clearly have global paralysis in terms of this extraordinary disjuncture between policy objectives and take-ups. The view we've got at the Climate Bonds Initiative is that finance will easily fall into place if demand is triggered. There is no problem in the energy efficiency side financing stuff except in residential, where the antidote is primarily scale, volume. 100 houses at a time, the unit price drops by 40% per house. It becomes financially viable. Every model used in the world, in the Western world today, a house-by-house change is just not economically viable, so requires direct, inefficient public subsidy, not a good model. There is a solution to that. That is where consumers are given the opportunity to delegate the decision about the management of the energy efficiency envelope they live in to trusted bodies such as municipalities. who take on the job of providing guarantees, fairness guarantees. Our greatest fear as consumers is being mugged on the way to the market. So fairness guarantees are required in return for municipalities sorting out bulk deals and delivering volume change at speed. There is actually, can be done and is relatively easy to be done and would make it entirely financially viable, in fact good returns, where what funding we have in energy efficiency, which is currently going into direct subsidies in many countries, should be used simply to construct the schemes and support municipalities to run this. So from an investor perspective, I can't get investors to say they'll invest in energy efficiency because they do not believe the government story about volume and liquidity. They do not believe the deals will flow and therefore it'll be a liquid market. They do tell me if governments would introduce mandatory schemes, auto-enrolment schemes or schemes like this, they will then invest because they think they have a chance to succeed. That's the opportunity for us. And it applies, according to Siemens, to Mittelstand in Germany too. So it applies to industrial as well as building and CBD building. So I would put that to you and see what you think.
Hi, I'm Young-Sung Kim from GGGI. I just wanted to ask for your opinion about incentives on clean technology, clean energy as well. Recently, we've been hearing from the EU that they are trying to impose tariff on solar panels produced from China. Yesterday, we saw from one of the presentations that the production of solar panels have exceeded the demand for the last 4 or 5 years. My question is, we've been quite successful in attracting investments into clean energy, but now we have such decrease in demand that we can no longer support the investments that have been made. Have we been successful using incentives to boost the clean energy sector, and what we can do in the future to continue to do so?
Thank you very much. My name is Philip Nies. 지금부터 한국말로 하겠습니다. 저는 대통령 직속 위원회의 여러 군데에서 일을 하며, 그리고 청와대를 포함한 행정부 그리고 국회의 국회의원들에게 각종 제안을 해오고 있습니다. 당연히 녹색성장위원회 그리고 GGGI를 포함한 국제기구가 만들어지는 과정들을 지켜봤으며 또 오늘까지 오게 되었습니다. 정책을 직접 만들기도 하고 그리고 그것을 집행하는 부분들을 해봤는데, 국가에서 차지하는 3요소가 있는데, 정부와 기업과 소비자라는, 국민이라는 3요소가 존재를 합니다. 그런데 이 정부는 어떤 정책을 좋다고 제안을 하더라도 기업과 그리고 소비자는 어떤 것에 의해서 판단하느냐면 그 기업과 본인이 이익이 되는지에 관해서 판단을 하고 행동을 한다는 것입니다. 대한민국에서도 각종 보조금이나 각종 지원 정책이나 그리고 세제 혜택을 줄 때는 움직이지만 그것이 줄어들거나 자기네 기업이나 개인한테 이득이 안 될 때는 그 선택을 하지 않는다는 것입니다. 그래서 제가 결론적으로 좀 말씀을 드리고 싶은 것은 결국은 오늘의 제목인 The Future of Green Growth의 가 어떻게 돼야 되는가는 제 의견을 좀 말씀을 드리면, 결국은 글로벌 그리고 각 국가 그리고 각 국가에 속해 있는 기업 그리고 소비자를 만족시킬 수 있는 구체적인 그리고 이익이 되는 정책과 그리고 제도와 그리고 이것을 지속 가능하게 제공해야 된다는 것이고, 그 방법은 아주 포지티브 폴리시 하는 방식이 있고, 하나는 각종 규제 수단을 동원하는 네거티브 폴리시가 있는데 결국은 네거티브 폴리시는 시간이 지나면 기업과 그리고 소비자들은 어떤 식으로든지 피할 수 있는 방법을 선택을 한다는 것입니다. 제가 결론적으로 짧게 말씀을 드리면 결국은 금융정책, 기술정책, 그리고 그 정부의 정책의 결정적인 것이 성공하려면 이 세 요소들이 만족할 수 있는, 그리고 오늘 여기 존경하는 패널분께서들, 스피커에서도 본인이 이 제품을, 이 정책을, 이 기술을 선택을 할 수 있는 그런 것을 제안을 했을 때 결국은 이것이 성공할 수 있다고 저는 생각을 합니다. 그래서 이것은 부단한 노력이 필요하다고 저는 생각을 합니다. 이상입니다.
Four very good questions. There are some common themes. Did anyone want to start out by tackling one or more of them, or shall I assign? There's one question on de-risking policy. There was and what to do about the global lobby, and if that is in any way detrimental to achieving the goals we are trying to link to risk mitigation, but also around Sean's question around money not, I'm trying to simplify this, Sean, but money is not at issue. The issue is how we effectively help from a policy, public perspective, mitigate the risk around that, what the incentives for clean technology need to look like. And I'm sorry about the I got a little mixed up on the interpretation, but the theme of the last question really was that governments, businesses, and consumers effectively all need, the policies has to be such that it needs to align the interest of all three, if you will, in order to actually deliver the outcomes and results that we are looking for. So, did you want to send some up? Go for it.
I'm not going to try and cover all the ground.
No, of course.
Let me just address three of them. On Peter's point on de-risking policy, I made the point very briefly, but it's worth making at greater length, or again, at least mentioning again, that successful policy reform requires a series of flanking measures, because if you take away a policy and introduce a new one, even if the new one is better, it has a whole series of disruptive effects, the cause of resistance. And if you plan for that and have a way to deal with it, it'll work better. One of the things we've been saying to the World Bank is one of the roles that they could play with countries that agree to reform their fossil fuel subsidies is to put in place this sort of enabling framework of flanking measures that ensure that the experience is as positive as possible, as quickly as possible, for the country that undertakes the reforms. When it comes to lobbies, this is the point I made about the political economy of change, and this is true here. It's true in every aspect of every public policy issue. This is nothing new. People who have access to power, who can organize, will defend their interests very vigorously, and you need to overcome that. And all I can say is that it's uphill. It's not easy. The power in the United States, for example, of the energy industry, the fossil energy industry, is very great. But if you look back and look at history, at the sort of ban on smoking in public places, for example, when I was a student in the U.S., we were told, forget it. The tobacco industry has the entire U.S. Congress in its pocket, and you'll never get anywhere, and you're wasting your time. And for a long time, we did waste our time, and then it simply flipped over onto the other side in a matter of a few years. So policy, the sort of public appetite for policy change grows and reaches a point where it breaks out. And I suspect that we are not far from that point, at least when it comes to fossil fuel subsidy reform and on quite a number of aspects of the carbon challenge. The final thing relates to your point, the solar. I mean, I think what's happening in the challenges to solar energy industry are incredibly unfortunate and incredibly clumsily handled. And I think what the European Union is doing is simply crazy. I think it's very, very poorly thought through. But there is a big question behind it. And the big question is basically, where do we want to go? And in deciding where we want to go, what's most important? Now, I would say, and you'd expect me to say it, that I want to go towards a green economy, all right? And so I want to look at all the policies that are out there and all the rules that are out there to make sure that they're at least not preventing that evolution from taking place. Now, you look at something like this. Any industry that grows very quickly in response to opportunity goes through times when there's a shakeout. And there's a shakeout. There's bound to be a shakeout now in the solar panel industry. It's not an unhealthy thing. I'm with you on letting the market do its magic on this. Let it happen. But let's be quite clear about something. We can't afford to have rules, like at least the way in which the WTO rules are currently interpreted, that means that, well, we could go towards renewable energy much more quickly, but the WTO rules don't allow us to do it. And I think we need to get to the point where we're saying we need global rules in our market that favor the direction that society has chosen to go in. And where they don't, they need to be reviewed.
I mean,
Please, go
Go ahead.
Just on that point, I think you're absolutely right that the issue is the use of the solar panels, not the protection of industries that are producing them.
Yeah.
So, if the international price is coming down, this makes it easier to make the transition to the use of solar panels. So it's a no-brainer. It's just that you get the vested interests around certain industries in particular countries that then begin to make it more difficult to use these panels. And therefore you end up shooting yourself in the foot just to protect your special interests. And it's really the case this is just one example of the special interest really predominating against the general interest of consumers and for global reforms. Coming back to your question about guarantees and municipalities, again, I think this is much easier in very advanced countries where the responsibilities of municipalities are clearly defined and they have own source revenues. The problem in most developing countries is that they don't. And if you are assigning risks at the local level by municipalities who are not really responsible for the liabilities that are being generated, you can get wrong results. And this is a problem of decentralization per se, because what you need then is a broader governance structure before you can move to assigning risks at that level. But there is still a problem of assigning risks in PPPs at the national level. And there's problems with wind farm PPPs in the UK. If you don't have proper recognition of public liabilities, you can end up making mistakes. And the tighter rules by IPSAS on the generation of liabilities and recognition of liabilities in public budgets is actually a step in the right direction. Now, of course, you have to utilize private finance because there isn't sufficient public finance and not likely to be, but there is a role for the state. And the role for the state, and you're absolutely right, has to be clearly defined and put in a medium-term context, which is why you don't want to be throwing away revenues which are being generated, A, by the carbon tax, and B, by a proper system of taxes, which must be at the core of a tax reform, which also includes a carbon tax. So, I mean, if you take the case of a country like Pakistan, if you start off with a 10% tax GDP ratio, Mexico is the same, 10% tax GDP ratio. You can't run a country of 200 million people with a 10% tax GDP ratio. You put in a carbon tax, which generates 1%, your overall revenue goes down to 8.5%, that's terrible. You cannot then begin to fund the public components of the investments that are likely to be needed, not just for carbon restructuring, but a whole range of public infrastructure or the provision of the Millennium Development Goal objectives. So you really have to look at it in the context of the full role of the state, how it is financed, and then the responsibilities and the allocation of responsibilities in the medium term. So this is a much broader set of issues on public finance and governance that is essential to have a proper role for the private sector to come in as a supplement to what the state should be doing. And what we've been touching here in this session is really a very, very small part of a much larger problem of governance. And the multi-level governance, which is essential to begin to address your very correct assessment, is a long-term issue, because if you go to Indonesia or you go to India, the local governments do not have the capacity to be taking on risks and liabilities. So I think you're right that this is what you should be doing, but unfortunately in many developing countries it just doesn't happen. In Latin America, apart from Colombia, there's no country that has proper own source financing at the municipal level. It's not the UK. So, you really do need to go in that direction, but, where are you going to start?
I'm tempted to say something on all of those, but I won't. In the interest of time, I'll pick a couple, and it's two that have already been touched upon. But, Peter's question about the $200 billion a year lobby. There's not much we can do to stop people talking and to stop money talking necessarily. If people want to say carbon is life and that smoking doesn't cause cancer and HDT or asbestos or whatever aren't dangerous, they will do so. And they have done so. But I think Mark is right that in the end, the facts win out and social norms do change, but they waste a lot of time. The problem in this context, though, is that time wasting is particularly pernicious, because more than any of those other examples, we actually lock into not just a physical infrastructure, but a mode of behaviour. And of course, the two are linked. If you're going to build sprawling suburbs with big houses, then you're going to get a lobby that's interested in low gas prices, right? And won't be particularly impressed with cycle lanes or public transport. So the physical and the psychological lock-in are two parts of the same coin, and the longer you lock in, of course, the stock of greenhouse gases go up. So time wasting is actually particularly pernicious. And if there were a penalty system which could be applied, that would be fantastic. I think this raises broader questions of electoral systems. It's no coincidence that some of these lobbies are perhaps less influential in European countries than they are in America with its system of campaign finance and so on. The UK has big petrochemical companies and large tobacco companies, proportionately larger than in the US, but they tend to have less influence. So there are lessons there, certainly, that need to be picked up. There's a great, I don't know her name, Orsekes, I don't know how you pronounce it, and the chap who's got a blog called something like Desmog Blog. If you Google that, you'll find that there's interesting, they list the PR companies that tend to do the dirty, or the kind of try to clean up, actually, these dirty, toxic companies. That's their niche. So the same people that defended smoking tobacco companies are now, defending ExxonMobil and others and trying to lobby. It's interesting. Same lobby groups, same PR companies. I'll just address one other issue: the question of solar panels and the excess supply and the EU. I mean, I don't know enough about the details of the EU case. If it is a genuine case of dumping, then actually it is right that the EU responds, because actually all that will, if it's restricting future competition, it will actually push up the supply of the cost of solar panels to the EU. Otherwise, I think you're absolutely right. To the extent that China has seen price drops due to induced innovation, learning and experience, then that's to the benefit of European consumers who gain consumer surplus by importing solar panels from China. It's no different to importing laptops from Korea or whatever else, flat screen TVs, that other countries have a greater comparative advantage in trade relative to Europe. And in fact, it's even better than that, because it gives China and other countries a stake in supporting climate negotiations, because they see the commercial benefits. So if it's anything other than an anti-dumping, a genuine anti-dumping approach, then it really isn't welcome, because it's protection that serves nobody's interest, either in terms of climate or in terms of European consumers.
Do you want to say something, especially as the only government representative, perhaps address the issue of alignment, if you can?
I'll just make some quick points. I mean, I agree very much with the comments made so far on the lobby industry. It is here to stay. It always will be. It's an inherent part of capitalism, I think, and it's political economy 101. The best way to fight the lobby industry is to use to fight political economy with political economy. Don't try and always win on a technocratic argument. Realise that there is a political economy out there, and you need to address some of those factors that are very legitimate. On the second question, I didn't quite capture all of it, but if I understood what you were saying, how to deal with some of the policy risk associated with some of the energy efficiency measures that governments have traditionally used, and trying to get a greater scale and volume so you can attract the investment you need. And I think we've all witnessed some of the policy risk around that with changing policy parameters, so I can understand why investment markets aren't too keen on some of the energy efficiency measures. However, I'm not too sure some of what you were suggesting would necessarily address that. In fact, I think some of those mandatory schemes have the same inherent policy risk as well. And I think that you therefore need to think through what's the reasons behind some of the policy risk. And I think that that's the policy risk exists, especially in those markets, because of a failure at times to account for distributional impacts from the start well enough. I think governments have reacted later when they've realised that some of these schemes have had an impact on consumers or segments that they hadn't sort of taken into account, and they hadn't sort of done the necessary groundwork or put the necessary social safety net in. So I'll just caution against thinking that scale is the only issue, although I agree generally, and I think a white certificate scheme, for example, or something like that can work really well. On partnership and alignment, or at least, well, I agree totally. I think that any government that thinks that they can do this by themselves without aligning themselves with consumer preference and business preferences and trying to build those coalitions is not going to succeed in the longer term. But equally, it's not just governments. I think that businesses need to realise too. I mean, if businesses who are a little sceptical about some of this thing think that their best strategy is to stay outside, I think that would be a bad mistake. I think the best thing they can do is engage with governments, policymakers and consumers and talk about the most appropriate fiscal instrument, bring their knowledge into consideration so that they can influence that direction rather than having something that they weren't consulted on imposed on them later. So I think partnerships apply for all three of those people and are incredibly important to the sustainability. So I would highly encourage that for anyone thinking of that.
Thank you. Well, I'm not even going to try, not only in the interest of time, but not even going to try and summarize that very rich discussion. I'll leave that to the rapporteur. What I would do is really do thank GGGI to force me to get out of my comfort zone, because I learned a tremendous amount from this very wonderful panel. So please join me in applauding them for their time and for their presence here. Thank you very much, everybody.